On my 78th birthday, my son calmly announced, "We've arranged a nursing home for you." My daughter-in-law looked at me and added, "You're useless now." That was when I knew I wasn't family anymore. I was something to be removed. That night I left the house with a small bag and $5,000 that no one knew about. Sitting alone at the pier, I thought everything was over, until a young woman picked up my brass compass. She looked at the name engraved on it, paused, then made a phone call. "Dad, I found him." And everything changed. I'm so glad you're here. Before we continue, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below. Please keep in mind that certain elements of this story have been fictionalized to enhance the experience and the lesson. It's the heart of the message that truly matters. I, Otis Pendleton, sat in the center of the West Haven Ridge dining room on my 78th birthday, my weathered hands resting on a tablecloth that cost more than my first workshop. The fabric was a heavy ivory silk so fine it felt offensive against the calloused skin of my palms. Palms that had spent half a century coaxing precision out of brass sextants and weathered cedar. The air in the room was thick with the cloying scent of expensive lilies and the sterile tang of floor wax, a combination that always made me feel like I was attending my own wake. Around the table sat a collection of strangers in tailored suits, men and women who spoke in the rapid-fire jargon of venture capital and commercial interest. My son Caleb Pendleton, who had just turned 49, adjusted his Italian silk tie before standing to deliver a birthday toast that I quickly realized was actually a death warrant for my independence. Caleb had grown into a man of sharp edges and expensive tastes, a far cry from the boy I'd taught to sand a hull. He raised a glass of Cabernet that glowed like a ruby under the crystal chandelier. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said, his voice carrying that practiced boardroom warmth. "Try not to spill the wine on the silk, okay? It's a celebration of longevity, or at least what's left of it." The guests chuckled a collective sound as dry as the crackers on the hors d'oeuvres tray. I looked down at my plate, feeling the itch of the starched collar against my neck. I wasn't a guest here, I was a prop. I realized then that this entire evening wasn't about me at all. It was a networking event, a chance for Caleb to display his family values to the investors he was wooing. I was merely the antique on display, a living testament to his supposed character. Have you ever felt like a ghost in a house you helped build brick by bitter brick? I sat there in a designer chair that seemed engineered for a posture I no longer possessed, feeling the emotional chill of being ignored by people who were looking right at me. Brooke Pendleton, Caleb's wife, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and sterile as a surgical blade, smiled at me with a pity that didn't reach her calculating eyes. She leaned in her perfume, a suffocating cloud of jasmine. "Otis, darling," she began, her voice a melodic patronization, "Caleb and I have been talking about decluttering the estate. That workshop of yours out back, it smells of salt and rot. It's simply useless now, isn't it? We need to think about the future of this property. Space is a luxury you're consuming, and all those old tools and rusted instruments are just taking up room for the new lap pool we're envisioning." I felt a surge of heat behind my eyes, a rare spark of the anger I usually kept submerged beneath a calm, reflective exterior. My workshop was where I had restored the chronometers of great explorers. It was where I had breathed life back into history. To her, it was just square footage. To me, it was my sanctuary. Then came the slap, not of a hand, but of a word. Useless. I gripped my silver fork until the metal bit into my thumb. Caleb set his glass down with a definitive clink against the fine china, drawing the room's attention back to him. He didn't look at me as he spoke. He addressed the room. "We've decided it's time for Otis to be somewhere safer," he announced. "Somewhere managed. We've been accepted into the Gables, a high-end assisted living facility. They have staff for everything, Dad. You won't have to worry about a thing starting tomorrow." He framed it as a gift, a grand gesture of filial devotion, but the steel in his tone told a different story. He was clearing the board. My daughter Skylar Pendleton, 46, and draped in designer pearls, didn't just stay silent. She was wearing my late wife's heirloom pearls, the ones she'd stolen from my dresser just hours before the dinner. When I looked at her, searching for a single spark of the girl I'd raised alone, she coolly adjusted the stolen strand and looked away into the dark glass of her wine. Her silence wasn't born of fear, but of a calculated predatory coldness. I realized then she wasn't Caleb's victim. She was his architect, and together they weren't just moving me, they were erasing me. The fine wine in my mouth suddenly tasted like rusted iron and seawater. Caleb leaned over, patting my hand with a touch that felt like ice. "You're too old to be useful here, Dad," he whispered loud enough for Brooke to hear. "Let the professionals handle the rest. We've already called the liquidators for the shop. They're coming to clear out the clutter while we move you in." The betrayal was absolute, a coordinated strike against my history and my dignity. I looked around the table at the smiling faces of the elite guests, none of whom cared that a man's life was being dismantled between the main course and dessert. I turned to Skylar one last time, my eyes pleading for a shred of the daughter I once knew, but she didn't even flinch. She simply ran a manicured finger over the stolen pearls, her gaze fixed on the empty space where I used to belong in her life. In that cold, shimmering reflection of the wine glass, I realized I was already a ghost to her. I didn't just walk away from that dinner table. I retreated like a wounded animal to the only burrow I had left, but the predators had already been there. Leaving Skylar behind in the dining room felt like amputating a limb that had long since gone necrotic. Her silence was a physical weight, a cold draft that followed me up the grand staircase of West Haven Ridge. I reached my bedroom and leaned against the heavy door, my chest heaving the anniversary of my birth, feeling more like the date of an impending execution. I needed to see something real, something that belonged to the man I used to be before I became an inconvenience to be managed. I walked over to the antique dresser, my hand reaching for the velvet-lined mahogany box that lived in the back corner of the top drawer. It had been my wife's, a repository for the few precious things we'd managed to save during the lean years at the shipyard. I touched the wood, but the usual comfort wasn't there. The dust on the dresser had been disturbed, swept away in jagged streaks by fingers that weren't mine. I flipped the lid open, and my heart didn't just sink, it stopped. The box was empty. The mahogany box sat open like a mouth with the teeth kicked out. Her engagement ring, the modest diamond I'd saved 3 years to buy, was gone. The strand of saltwater pearls I'd gifted her on our 25th anniversary, the ones she'd worn in every family photo Skylar and Caleb were ever in, had vanished. They didn't even leave the box locked. They hadn't just planned my future. They had already liquidated my past, stripping the very identity from my dresser. It wasn't just gold and stones. It was her life. It was my life. The fury that rose in me then was cold and sharp, a precision tool, forged in the fires of absolute betrayal. Caleb hadn't been stressed, or making changes for my benefit. He had been looting the corpse of my marriage while I was still breathing in the next room. I stood in the center of the sterile, high-end guest room I'd occupied for a decade, realizing that every luxury Caleb had provided was a bribe to keep me quiet while he picked my pockets. The fine linens, the designer lamps, they were all bars on a cage. A soft, frantic knock at the door made me jump. I moved to the lock, my fingers trembling, and pulled it open just a crack. My 19-year-old grandson, Arlo Pendleton, lingered in the shadow of the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed and a burner phone clutched tightly in his hand. He slipped inside before I could speak, his movements possessed by a frantic, jittery energy I'd never seen in him. "Grandpa, you have to go," he whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying urgency. "They're not waiting for next week. I heard Dad on the phone with the transport team. They're scheduled for 4 o'clock this morning. They think if they take you in the dark, you won't make a scene." He reached into his pocket and pressed a small plastic tracking tile in the burner phone into my palm. Incompetent. That was the word on the paper I found on the printer, a death sentence in black ink. Arlo's hands were shaking as he showed me the second document, a presumptive death and permanent incapacity filing. They weren't just locking me away, they were legally erasing my existence. I stared at a draft of my own obituary, already uploaded to a private server, waiting for a single click to tell the world Otis Pendleton was gone. Skylar had even initiated the life insurance activation process, providing a witness statement claiming I'd been dangerously incoherent for months. I realized then that by the time I reached the facility, I wouldn't just be a patient, I would be a ghost. A nameless ward of the state, while they divided the spoils of a man who was technically still breathing. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow Caleb could have landed. I wasn't being moved for my safety, I was being liquidated. My own flesh and blood had sat across from me at dinner toast, in hand, while they mentally buried me in a shallow grave of legal jargon and forged ink. Every memory of raising them, every sacrifice I'd made at the shipyard, felt like a fuel they were now using to burn my legacy to the ground. I wasn't a father to them anymore, I was an accrued liability that needed to be written off. I looked at the boy, the only one of my blood who still possessed a soul, and I saw the terror he was feeling. He'd used his own meager savings from the bookstore to buy me a way out. "Don't let them find you, Grandpa. If you get to the facility, they'll sedate you. You'll never get out." The gravity of the situation settled over me like a shroud. I wasn't just being asked to move, I was being hunted. I moved with a sudden practiced efficiency, the years of shipyard discipline overriding my fear. I pulled my old wax canvas bag from the closet, the one I'd used for 30 years to carry my restoration tools. I packed only the essentials, a heavy sweater, my medicine, a few changes of clothes, and the small brass-bound compass that had seen me through every storm on the Maine coast. Deep in the lining of my coat, I felt for the envelope I'd hidden months ago containing the $5,000 in cash I'd slowly skimmed from my Social Security checks. Money Caleb thought he was controlling. I took one last look around the room, the moonlight catching the empty mahogany box on the dresser. It wasn't a home. It was a cell, and the bars were made of silken lies. I sat at the small writing desk and took a single sheet of paper. "I won't be a piece of clutter for you to manage anymore." I wrote, the ink stark against the white page. "Keep the house, Caleb. It's as hollow as you are." I left the note on the pillow where they expected to find a compliant, broken old man. Would you leave your history behind to save your future? I had to. I followed Arlo to the service stairwell, the cold air of the Maine night already beginning to seep through the walls. He hugged me once, a quick, desperate squeeze, and then I was alone in the dark. The service door at the back of the estate groaned as I pushed it open. Outside, the air smelled of rain and ozone, a storm rolling in from the Atlantic. I stepped out into the fog, the weight of the canvas bag pulling at my shoulder, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. As the heavy oak service door clicked shut behind me, the first siren of the night wailed in the distance, and I realized I wasn't just a father leaving home. I was a fugitive in my own town. The salt air usually smelled like life to me, but tonight it tasted like the copper of my own blood, as my heart hammered, a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I had made it to Brindle Pier, but the victory felt hollow as the world began to tilt on its axis. The Maine rain was no longer a mist. It was a cold, driving force that sought to push me into the dark Atlantic. Every step was a negotiation with a body that was rapidly withdrawing its consent. As the heavy oak service door had clicked shut behind me at the estate, leaving me a fugitive in my own town, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The paranoia of being followed had sustained me for the first mile, but now the physical toll of the night was demanding payment in full. My vision began to tunnel the edges of the pier, blurring into a swirling gray vortex. I reached for a weathered wooden bench, my fingers slick with rain, but I never quite made it. A sudden sharp pressure behind my eyes signaled the hypertensive crisis I had been fearing. "Not here," I whispered to the empty air, but my voice was a ghost I couldn't catch. I collapsed my knees, hitting the wet planks with a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the pier. As I fell, the canvas bag slipped from my shoulder, and my most prized possession, my antique brass compass, slid across the wood. Click! The compass hit the wood, the sound of my legacy rolling away into the shadows. I watched it go, paralyzed by the storm raging in my chest, unable to even lift a finger to retrieve the one thing that still connected me to my late wife and the career I had loved. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps, and for the first time in nearly 8 decades of life, I truly believed I was looking at the end. The dark water beneath the pier seemed to rise up to meet me, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the silence. "Sir, can you hear me?" The voice was distant, filtered through the pounding of my blood. I felt a hand on my neck, cool and professional, checking for a pulse. I forced my eyes open and saw a young woman kneeling in the mud and rain beside me. Andrea Sterling, a 24-year-old nurse with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a calm that suggested she was used to the chaos of the ER. Didn't seem to care that her uniform was being ruined by the grime of the pier. "Stay with me," she said, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "I'm a nurse. You're having a critical crisis." I tried to point toward the compass, but she was already focused on stabilizing my breathing. Most people would have called an ambulance and moved on, but Andrea stayed. She picked up the brass compass that had come to rest against a piling, and I saw her entire posture stiffen. She turned it over her thumb, tracing the deep engraving on the back to Otis, for guiding the way home. How many lives can a single act of kindness save? I was about to find out. Pendleton. She breathed, her eyes widening as she looked back at me. Otis Pendleton? My God, my father? He's been looking for you for decades. She didn't wait for my confirmation. She pulled out a phone, her fingers flying across the screen. Dad, I found him. No, I'm sure. Brindle Pier. He's in a bad way. You need to come now. I wanted to tell her I didn't want to be a burden, that I was just an old man who had run out of time, but the world was slipping away again. 20 minutes passed in a blur of Andrea's reassurances and the distant wail of the wind. Then the silence of the pier was shattered by the screech of tires. A high-security black SUV cut through the fog, its yellow headlights blinding as they cut a path toward us. A man stepped out, ignoring the rain that immediately soaked his expensive suit. Vance Sterling, a 55-year-old giant of the logistics world, stepped out of the black SUV with a look of pure reverence that I hadn't seen directed at me in a decade. He wasn't the billionaire I'd seen on the cover of magazines. He was a ghost from a life I thought I'd forgotten. He ran toward us, falling to his knees in the puddles beside Andrea, his hands shaking as he took the compass from her. Vance. I managed to wheeze the memory of a hollow-cheeked boy with torn boots flickering in my mind. The boy I had helped 45 years ago, the one whose vocational fees I had paid in secret when he had nothing. Vance didn't look like a billionaire tech titan. He looked like a lost sailor who had finally found his North Star. Mr. Pendleton, he said, his voice cracking with an emotion that transcended his power. The debt of honor has finally come due. You're never going to a nursing home. You're coming to mine. Andrea helped him lift me, their combined strength, a physical manifestation of the protection I had lacked for so long. As the heat of the SUV's interior enveloped me, the cold weight of the night began to lift, replaced by a terrifying, wonderful realization. The man I had saved when the world turned its back on him had returned to do the same for me. As Vance lifted me into the SUV, he whispered something that chilled me more than the main rain. Otis, I know what Caleb did to your accounts, and I've already started the counterstrike. The navigator had arrived, and for the first time since my birthday dinner, the needle on my internal compass finally pointed toward home. I thought I knew the limits of human greed, but staring at a backlit screen in Vance's study, I realized my children hadn't just stolen my money, they had calculated the price of my living death. I woke up in a room that smelled of old leather and high-end air filtration, a far cry from the salt-crusted air of Brindle Cove. Vance Sterling had placed me in a guest suite that was larger than my entire first house, but the opulence felt like a staging ground for the war I was about to wage. By the second day of my stay, the medical crisis had passed, replaced by a cold, vibrating clarity. Vance sat across from me in his private study, his silhouette framed by the blue hum of 3 massive computer monitors. He introduced his lead cybersecurity specialist, a young man who had breached Caleb's private cloud server with a speed that would have terrified me if he weren't on my side. Look at this, Otis Vance said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. They show me a spreadsheet titled Pendleton Transition. I leaned forward, my hands gripping the arms of the leather chair. It was a digital autopsy of my life. Caleb had calculated the resale value of every maritime instrument in my workshop, right down to the 18th century octants I had spent years restoring. But it was the second tab that broke what was left of my heart. He and Schuyler had already mapped out the exact split of my $480,000 inheritance. Caleb's real estate empire was a hollow shell built on high-interest loans from people you don't say no to. He didn't just want my money. He needed my life's work to collateralize a debt that would otherwise cost him his head. They had a line item for my funeral, Vance spending the life insurance before I've even been sedated. I watched as Vance scrolled further, realizing Caleb had chosen his own skin over my soul without a second thought. In the attached witness statement, Schuyler described my worsening delusions with a poetic cruelty, claiming I'd been wandering the halls of West Haven Ridge, at night, dangerous and confused. It's not just a plan, Otis. It's a transaction, Vance said, pointing to a ledger of transfers. They've already pulled $200,000 of your cash out to cover Caleb's failing real estate debts. He's been hemorrhaging money for months. By the third morning, the grief had been fully refined into iron. I sat in that study and watched as Vance's elite legal firm prepared the counterstrike. They weren't just looking for a settlement. They were filing for a debt of honor lien and an emergency freeze on every asset Caleb owned. Vance handed me a heavy gold-trimmed fountain pen. I want them to feel exactly what I felt when that service door clicked shut, I said, my voice steady. The silence of having no choice. Click, sign, revenge. The pen felt like a scalpel in my hand as I authorized Vance to represent me in all matters. We aren't just taking back the money, Otis. We're taking back your name, Vance promised. He spent the afternoon prepping the encryption for the call. It was time to stop being a fugitive and start being the architect of their downfall. At 3 o'clock, a three-way secure video link was initiated. Caleb and Skylar appeared on the screen sitting in the West Haven Ridge Library. Caleb looked annoyed, adjusting his cufflinks, while Skylar checked her reflection in her phone. They clearly thought this was a call from the transport company they'd hired to find me. Caleb actually laughed when the connection established his face, a mask of practiced concern, as he claimed I was being held captive and brainwashed by a corporate predator. You're too late, Sterling. Caleb sneered, holding up a copy of the emergency guardianship order he thought was already being enforced by the local precinct. He truly believed he had won, that his plan to erase me was untouchable. He was still gloating about my deteriorating state when Vance played the final card, the recorded audio of Caleb and Skylar arguing over the exact wording of my fake obituary. The arrogance on the screen vanished instantly, replaced by the gray, sickening realization that their cage now had bars on both sides. Vance's face appeared on the screen, his tone terrifyingly calm as he stopped Caleb, mid-sentence. Your father is my guest Caleb, and he is in full possession of his faculties, which is more than I can say for your ethics. I stepped into the frame, then standing just behind Vance like a living ghost witnessing their panic. The color drained from Caleb's face until he looked like the very spirits he thought he could bury. Skylar let out a small strangled sound, her hand flying to the pearls she'd stolen from my dresser. Otis discovered the forgery. Vance continued, his eyes locked on the camera. I discovered the doctor who signed that dementia diagnosis was your old college roommate, who's currently drowning in gambling debt. We have the emails. We have the wire transfers. Your father is choosing not to engage with you personally, but I am not so patient. You have 72 hours to return $650,000, the principal, the interest, and the damages, or I hand these forged medical records to the FBI. The digital distortion of Skylar's voice as she began to sob was the only sound in the room. Caleb's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked smaller through the lens, a predator realizing he'd become the prey. Vance revealed the final blow with a savage satisfaction. I've already secured an emergency freeze on your firm's main operating account, Caleb. You're done. As the screen went black, the silence in the study was absolute. I took a sip of ice water, the coldness refreshing my throat, finally clear of the salt and fog. Vance turned to me, his phone buzzing with a new notification. That wasn't the best part, Otis. Look at what Arlo just sent from your son's private safe. He turned a tablet toward me, showing photos of physical documents Arlo had managed to snap before slipping out of the house. I realized then that the betrayal went even deeper than a financial split. Caleb wasn't just hiding money. He was hiding a legacy of corruption that would ensure he never wore an Italian silk tie again. I watched the heavy steel door of Vance's safe swing open, but it was the digital folder Arlo had bypassed that held the real weapons of my restoration. Vance sat me down in the high-backed leather chair of his study, his expression a mask of grim satisfaction. He didn't say a word as he turned the primary monitor toward me, revealing the contents of the safe Arlo had managed to photograph before his hurried departure from West Haven Ridge. I felt a cold chill settle in my marrow as I scrolled through the digital evidence. Caleb didn't just want the money. The safe files reveal he was using my antique maritime instruments, the octants and chronometers that were my life's work, as collateral for a high-interest underground loan to cover his real estate hemorrhaging. But the real dagger, the one that turned my grief into something sharp and clinical, was the original medical evaluation. It was a clean bill of health signed by a reputable neurologist 3 months ago stating, I was in perfect mental standing and possess a sharp analytical mind. Right next to it was a ledger of cash payments made to Caleb's old college roommate, the corrupt doctor who had subsequently signed the forged dementia papers. He kept the evidence of my sanity like a trophy. I whispered, my voice thick with a mixture of profound grief and cold vindication. Vance nodded, his hands folded neatly on the mahogany desk, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. It's not a trophy anymore, Otis. It's the key to his cell. We now have proof of premeditated fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse. We aren't just looking at a lawsuit. We are looking at a full-scale criminal takedown that will strip them of everything they tried to steal from you. Bang, the gate locked, the sound of a son being cast out. I watched the security monitors as Caleb and Brooke arrived at the Sterling Estate gates on the 5th day. They looked small and frantic through the lens, stripped of the polished arrogance and Italian silk they had worn at my birthday dinner. Caleb was screaming at the intercom, his face a mottled purple, claiming I was being kidnapped and brainwashed by a corporate predator. He didn't know that the local police were already parked 2 blocks away, simply waiting for Vance's signal. I watched as a member of Vance's security team stepped out and calmly served them with a temporary restriction order. Caleb's mouth opened in a silent digital wail as he realized he was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of me or communicating with me in any way. I chose to remain silent, watching the man I had raised be led away from the gate by his own desperation, his shadow lengthening against the asphalt as he realized the gates of his world were closing forever. Before I expose the truth behind the homecoming to Brindle Cove, are you still holding on to this story with me? Comment justice if you would have reported him to the authorities immediately, or mercy if you would have given him one last private warning, and tell me your one-word reason why, so I can see how you're reading this. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to deepen the emotional impact. The core message is what I hope stays with you. Coming home was like a clock finally catching its gears after a decade of slipping. Vance didn't just hire a legal team. He had quietly bought the mortgage on Caleb's firm's building, effectively becoming my son's new landlord and overseer. But my heart wasn't in the high-rises or the legal battles. It was in the salt air and the honest grain of wood. I finally returned to my original home and workshop in Brindle Cove 2 weeks later, the morning air crisp and tasting of the Atlantic. The main house had been modernized by Caleb into a sterile shell of gray paint and glass. But as I stepped into the workshop at the back of the property, I felt a surge of hope that I hadn't felt in years. My 19-year-old grandson, Arlo Pendleton, was already there, his clothes stained with sawdust, and his eyes bright with a secret. He led me to the back corner of the shop near the old forge, and pulled back a section of the floorboards I hadn't touched in over a decade. I thought they'd stripped it all bare, Arlo, I said, my breath catching as I saw the gleaming brass of my 18th century octants and the heavy mahogany cases of my rare chronometers. Arlo wiped a smudge of dust from a glass lens and handed it to me with a steady hand. They didn't look deep enough, Grandpa. They never did. They only saw the resale value on a spreadsheet. They didn't see the history or the soul of the work. I realized then that Arlo hadn't just been a messenger during my escape. He's been training as an apprentice boatwright in secret for months at the local shipyard, preparing himself to carry on the Pendleton legacy and the craft I thought would die with me. My calloused fingers didn't shake when I picked up the chisel. They remembered exactly what to do, the weight of the tool feeling like an extension of my own arm. The smell of cedar and linseed oil began to fill the room, a perfume more precious and real than any Brooke had ever worn in her life. Vance Sterling stood in the doorway watching us work, with a quiet pride, treating me with the reverence of a son who had finally found the father he deserved. I touched the cool, heavy metal of a reclaimed brass instrument and felt the soul of my life returning to my hands, the needle finally pointing toward a true north I had discovered on my own. For the first time in all my years, the workshop didn't feel like a place of labor or an attic of clutter. It felt like a kingdom I had reclaimed. As the first scent of cedar filled the room, the perimeter alarm at the workshop gate chimed, and a familiar broken shadow appeared on the threshold, silhouetted against the morning sun. I didn't need to check the security monitors to know the stench of desperation was standing just beyond my workshop gate. The salt air of Brindle Cove was usually pure, but as I walked toward the perimeter of my reclaimed property, the morning breeze carried the sour, unmistakable scent of cheap gin and unwashed silk. I stood on my side of the iron bars, looking at the man who had shared my blood, but none of my honor. Caleb Pendleton was a hollowed-out version of the predator who had toasted to my obsolescence at West Haven Ridge. His designer jacket was wrinkled and stained at the lapels, and his hands, once manicured for the golf course, were trembling with a fine, rhythmic palsy. He looked at me and saw a bank. I looked at him and saw a hollow shell. "Dad, please," he rasped, his voice a dry rattle. It was Brooke. She pushed me to do it. She was the one who found the doctor, the one who said we needed the cash for the expansion. You have to help me one last time. The firm is gone, the accounts are frozen, and there's a public scandal brewing in the papers that will bury me. I stayed silent, watching him realize that the man he called useless clutter is now the only one holding the keys to his survival. He gripped the iron bars, his knuckles white, begging for a loan that would never come. I am not your safety net, Caleb. I am the man you tried to erase from existence. You didn't just steal my money, you tried to steal my mind. He began to ramble about Skylar, revealing that her own husband had divorced her the moment the scandal hit the social circuit, leaving her exactly where she feared most without a title or a chair at the gala. It was a domino effect of greed, and I was the only piece left standing. I turned my back on his pleas and walked to a scrap pile near the forge. I picked up an old handsaw, its blade orange with a thick coat of rust, and its teeth dulled by decades of neglect. I walked back to the gate and thrust the tool through the bars. Take this, I said, my voice as heavy and cold as an anchor. It's the only thing I'm giving you. Caleb stared at the rusted metal as if I'd handed him a venomous snake. What am I supposed to do with this? I'm an investment manager, Dad. I don't use tools. I leaned in close, the steel of my resolve reflecting in my eyes. If you want to be useful, Caleb, go to the shipyard. Tell Bill Higgins I sent you. He values sweat over spreadsheets. Work for him for 2 years. Learn how to fix what you broke with your own 2 hands. Until you know the value of $1 you actually earned, you have no place in the Pendleton family. I left him there, the sound of his sobbing muffled by the rising wind of the Maine coast. Do you know the sound of a legacy beginning again? It sounds like a saw biting into fresh cedar. I didn't look back as I walked to my porch where a thick white envelope had been left during the night. I opened it and found a letter from Skylar, but it wasn't the words that mattered. Inside was a cashier's check for $115,000. The exact amount she had pocketed from the jewelry liquidation returned without a single word of defense. It was her own silent admission of defeat, a ghost of a conscience finally manifesting in the wreckage of her life. By the final day of August, the town of Brindle Cove had gathered at the lower docks for the grand opening of the Pendleton Maritime Community Library. I stood on the small wooden podium, flanked by Vance, Sterling, and Arlo. Vance looked at me with the quiet reverence of a son who had finally found the father he deserved, while Arlo stood with his chest out, a master in training. I looked out at the community I had served for 50 years and realized that my value had never been a variable on Caleb's spreadsheet. In the far distance on the lower repair docks, I caught sight of a man in a grime-covered jumpsuit struggling to move a heavy timber under the watchful eye of Bill Higgins. Caleb was finally beginning the honest labor he once mocked, a slow restoration of a soul that had been derelict for too long. To the hands that build and the hearts that remember, I said to the crowd, my voice carrying across the water. I'm proud of you, Grandpa Arlo whispered, his hand on my shoulder. The museum clock didn't just chime. It sang for the man who finally knew his own worth. I looked at the gold-plated compass Vance had restored for me, the needle steady and true, and I knew that the storms were finally behind me. I wasn't just a retired restorer or an aging father. I was a sovereign master of my own life. I had set my boundaries in steel, and they had held against the tide. I placed my hand on the heavy oak door of my shop, the museum clock, striking 12 in a perfect resonant chime. I closed the workshop door, the heavy latch clicking into place like the final gear of a masterpiece. For the first time in my 78 years, the silence didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like victory. I wasn't trying to prove my worth to anyone anymore. I simply was, and that was more than enough. I had finally learned that the most important thing I ever restored wasn't a clock or a compass. It was the man standing in the center of the room. I used to believe that being a good father meant giving everything without limits. But looking back, I see my mistake. I gave without boundaries. And in doing so, I allowed others to forget my worth. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. Do not wait until you are broken to protect yourself. Love your family, but never at the cost of your dignity. These grandpa revenge stories aren't about anger, they're about awakening. These grandpa revenge stories remind us that silence can cost more than conflict. And these grandpa revenge stories prove that reclaiming your life is never too late. In my journey, I've learned that true strength isn't in holding on. It's in knowing when to stand firm. The best grandpa stories are not about suffering quietly, but about rising with clarity. These grandpa stories teach that respect must be mutual. And these grandpa stories show that even after betrayal, you can rebuild something stronger within yourself. I believe God placed the right people in my path at the right time, not to save me, but to remind me who I was. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd truly appreciate hearing your thoughts. What would you do if you were in a situation like mine facing betrayal from your own family? Your perspective matters more than you think. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. Just a gentle note. While inspired by real-life themes, certain elements have been adapted for storytelling. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.